Dave, to the San Diego World Affairs Council for inviting me, and thanks, excuse me, to all of you for joining this Zoom session. My book, The Titans of the 20th Century, consists of essays on 8 major political figures from the first half of the 20th century. And Dave has given you their names. I wrote the book for 2 reasons. First, to remind people or to inform them of just who these titans were. They once dominated the world's headlines, but that was an increasingly long time ago. The second reason was to address a question that in the study of the past is, on the one hand, all but unavoidable, but on the other hand, cannot be answered definitively. And that question is, what is the impact of individuals on history? Well, these were all individuals who did make an impact on history, and each of the 8 essays, each of the 8 chapters, includes an assessment, necessarily subjective and personal, of what difference it made that this individual held the position he did at the time he did. What did he cause to happen that probably would not have happened had he not been in the place he was at the time he was? One more introductory note. You will notice that all of the 8 titans, Wilson, Lenin, Hitler, Churchill, FDR, Gandhi, Ben-Gurion, and Mao, were males. The reason is that in the period that I have covered in this book, all of the important leaders were men. The careers of Indira Gandhi, Golda Meir, and Margaret Thatcher came in the second half of the 20th century. I'll say something about each of the 8 titans with whom I deal, and then I'll close with a few thoughts on what the book and the people I portray in it have to tell us about the present and immediate future of the United States and the international order. The first titan was Woodrow Wilson, the 28th American president, and he was a prophet without honor in his own time. Not only that, but as a policymaker, he was more or less a failure. His most important policy initiative was his part in devising a political settlement at the end of World War I at the Peace Conference in Paris. The principal goal of that settlement was to ensure that there would never be another comparable war. But 2 decades later, World War II broke out. Moreover, Wilson believed that the key to establishing and maintaining peace was the international organization of which he was the principal architect, the League of Nations. But he did not succeed in getting the United States Senate to approve American membership in the League, and the United States never joined. Given these failures, therefore, on what basis can he be deemed a titan of the 20th century? Well, that status has to do with the ideas about how to organize global politics and economics that he put squarely on the international agenda and that have remained there ever since. These ideas are so closely identified with him that they are sometimes called Wilsonianism. Wilsonianism consists of a strong preference for international organizations among and democracy within sovereign states, for free trade and for limitations on armaments, all as ways to establish and perpetuate peace. Now, Wilson's own country, the United States, has never conducted a purely Wilsonian foreign policy, and sometimes American foreign policy has not been Wilsonian at all, but Wilson's ideas have been consistently important. American policymakers have always had to take them into account and have sometimes tried to implement them. Furthermore, other countries have also adopted a Wilsonian approach to international relations. Since 1945, the countries of Western Europe, the members of the European Union, have in important ways themselves carried out Wilsonian foreign policies. For that reason, I think the 100 years since Woodrow Wilson's death can appropriately be called the Wilsonian century. Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany entirely legally on January 30th, 1933, but he then proceeded to impose a brutal dictatorship and to start World War II in Europe, the most destructive war in the long history of that continent that had seen many wars. Moreover, Hitler was personally responsible for history's worst crime, the murder of 6 million European Jews known as the Holocaust. Among the 8 titans depicted in the Titans of the 20th century, Hitler has a particular distinction. Everything that he believed in and that he tried to build was discredited and discarded almost immediately after his death. Adolf Hitler left no living legacy. Vladimir Lenin was the leader of a small group of radical Russian Marxists known as the Bolsheviks. When World War I broke out, pitting Russia against Germany, he was in exile in Switzerland, and the German government smuggled him back into Russia with an eye toward subverting the Russian war effort, at which they did have some success. The minute Lenin arrived back in the then capital of the Russian Empire, St. Petersburg, he began to agitate in favor of the Bolsheviks seizing power in that city. At first, his colleagues thought that he was crazy. They resisted. They thought that this was a hopeless task. But Lenin continued to agitate, to press, to lobby, to insist. And finally, in October 1917, the Bolsheviks did take power in St. Petersburg. They did so in conditions of utter chaos. Lenin later said that they had found power lying in the streets and simply picked it up. And they proceeded to consolidate it over the next several years by winning a bloody civil war throughout the Russian Empire. Vladimir Lenin has a claim to having been the most influential person in all of the 20th century. Without Lenin, there would have been no Russian Revolution. Without the Russian Revolution, there would have been no Chinese Communist Revolution, and indeed no communism in power anywhere. By some estimates, communism in power led to 100 million premature deaths in the last century. So Lenin's influence cannot be said to have been benign. Winston Churchill, the 4th Titan, was the wartime Prime Minister of Great Britain and Hitler's great adversary. And Churchill and Great Britain finally defeated Nazi Germany with not inconsiderable assistance from the Soviet Union and the United States. Churchill and Britain could not have defeated Germany alone. They could not have won the war by themselves, but they could have lost it. And they would have lost it if Churchill and the British had accepted a proposal that Hitler made for the British to maintain their overseas empire in exchange for Britain leaving the war and conceding the dominance of Europe to Nazi Germany. The offer came at a time when France had fallen in June 1940, and Great Britain was the only country actively resisting the Nazis anywhere on the planet. A number of prominent and powerful officials in Great Britain, including key members of Churchill's cabinet, wanted to accept the proposal. But Churchill was adamantly opposed, and through his determination and his eloquence, he kept Britain in the war until the grand alliance of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union finally prevailed. Their victory spared Europe a period of indeterminate length of unparalleled barbarism, which the Nazis would have imposed. For that reason, to say that Winston Churchill saved civilization is not an understatement. Franklin Roosevelt, the 32nd American president, was Churchill's wartime partner, although their partnership was not always an easy one. They disagreed on some major issues, such as the future of the British Empire, to the continuation of which Churchill was passionately devoted, but that Roosevelt thought ought to be brought to an end. But they put aside their differences for the sake of their common cause in defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Roosevelt guided the United States through the Great Depression of the 1930s, and then, after the fall of France, he persuaded a skeptical Congress and a reluctant country to send economic and military aid to Great Britain. And after Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, Roosevelt managed to persuade an even more skeptical Congress and an even more skeptical country to send economic and military aid to the Soviet Union as well. After the United States formally entered World War II as a result of the Japanese attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December 7th, 1941, Roosevelt became a wartime commander-in-chief. As such, he made a number of crucial decisions. The decisions that he made were controversial at the time that he made them, and historians have criticized them subsequently. But in retrospect, those decisions seem, at least to me, to have been the right ones. For example, after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt decided that the main thrust of the American military effort would be directed to the European theater of war, even though the attack that brought the United States into the war had come from Asia, where the United States was fighting as well. Then Roosevelt decided that the first major American military operation would take place in North Africa, and Operation Torch was launched in November 1942. This operation met with opposition among Roosevelt's military advisors, who regarded it as a diversion from the main business of the war, which was to attack and defeat Germany as directly and swiftly as possible. Roosevelt, however, believed that the American armed forces were not prepared to take on Germany directly in 1942, but that the American public had to see its army in action in that calendar year in order to maintain domestic political support for the war effort. Finally, Roosevelt decided that the great Anglo-American Canadian assault on the European continent should take place in the middle of 1944. And what became known as Operation Overlord The landings in Normandy in northern France began on June 6th of that year, a date subsequently known to history as D-Day. In choosing that time, Roosevelt went against the wishes of one of his two principal wartime allies, the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, who wanted the attack to take place much earlier, but he also contradicted the strongly expressed wishes of his other major ally, Winston Churchill, who wanted to defer it, perhaps indefinitely. Franklin Roosevelt ranks historically as one of America's three great commanders-in-chief, along with George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. And not coincidentally, the three of them were the nation's commanders-in-chief during its three most important wars: the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and World War II. Mohandas Gandhi became the best-known Indian since Siddhartha Gautama, known as the Buddha. Gandhi himself had an honorific. He was known as the Mahatma. The word is a fusion of two Hindi words, Maha meaning great and Atma meaning soul. Gandhi was the great soul. Some of his most cherished ideas had to do not with politics, but with individual conduct. And in that sense, he was more a religious than a political figure. But he did have a major political impact on the history of the 20th century as well. One of the major developments of the last century was the end of the European overseas empires. The largest, in some ways the most important of these, and the first to disappear, was the British Empire in India, and Gandhi had major responsibility for that. Before he joined it, the Indian independence movement, known as the Indian National Congress, consisted of a handful of wealthy Indians, most of them high-caste Hindus, whom the British could easily manage. Gandhi turned it into a mass movement that the British could not resist. He made a second contribution to the history of the 20th century. One of the techniques that Gandhi employed to put pressure on the British was nonviolent protest. He learned these techniques, indeed, he developed them in South Africa in the 2 decades he lived there before returning to India. And nonviolent protest was adopted by other peoples at other times in other places, including the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. So Mohandas Gandhi was the father of modern political nonviolence. The seventh Titan, David Ben-Gurion, was the father of his country being Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people. Ben-Gurion became the leader of the Jewish national movement known as Zionism in the ancestral Jewish homeland that, between the 2 world wars, was the British Mandatory Territory of Palestine. Ben-Gurion did not achieve his titanic status by any charismatic traits. He had none. What elevated him historically was his almost uncanny ability to anticipate the future. Earlier than almost any Zionist, he saw that there would be a great war in Europe, that whatever the outcome, the British would have to leave Palestine, that when that happened, the opportunity to proclaim their long-sought and long-cherished state would become available to the Zionists. But after having done so, they would have to be able to defend it against the onslaught of their Arab neighbors. And for that, they needed a Jewish army, something the Jewish people had not really had for almost 2,000 years. David Ben-Gurion, more than anybody else, was responsible for that army, the Israel Defense Forces, which have defended Israel for 76 years. Ben-Gurion was also the first prime minister of independent Israel, serving from 1948 to 1963. And in that capacity, he did more than anybody else to assure that Israel would become and would remain a democracy. To this day, the only democracy in the Middle East. The final titan, Mao Zedong, was a founding member of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921 and developed the strategies that enabled the communists to come to power in what was then the world's most populous country in 1949. From that date until his death in 1976, he acted as the supreme leader of all of the country. And as such, he had a penchant for inflicting on the country highly disruptive national campaigns. For example, in the 1950s, he began what came to be called the Great Leap Forward. Its purpose was to have China surpass the Western democracies in industrial output. It did not achieve this goal, but it did trigger a famine, which turned out to be the worst in the long history of a country that had had many famines. Then in the 1960s, he was the author and instigator of what he called the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Its purpose was to remove the chief obstacles, at least what Mao considered the obstacles, to the attainment of genuine communism, as he defined it in China. Among those obstacles he identified was the Communist Party itself, which he had headed. And he launched an assault on that party, which involved the persecution and sometimes the death of many people with whom he had worked closely for decades. The Cultural Revolution turned into a veritable civil war, causing great destruction before it finally ended. Mao Zedong has a singular distinction. Because the famine of the Great Leap Forward is estimated to cause perhaps as many as 40 million deaths, and because Mao's other campaigns and his regular mode of governance caused millions of more deaths, he has the distinction of having been the greatest mass murderer in all of history. Well, that concludes my remarks on the Titans. What, if anything, does the book have to tell us about America and the world today? The United States has just elected a president who has been suspected of or charged with harboring autocratic instincts and seeking to overturn America's 250-year experiment in democracy. That aspiration, if he truly holds it, compares with some of the achievements of the great titans of the first half of the last century that I portray in the book, and specifically puts him in the company, or at least on the outskirts of the company, of the three great dictators about whom I've written: Lenin, Hitler, and Mao, to one of whom, Hitler, he has been explicitly compared. Is there a chance that Donald Trump will follow in the footsteps of the three great dictators? Well, on the basis of my study of them and what I've written about them, my answer to that question is a definitive no. Trump differs from the great dictators in three central important ways. First, he's a very different kind of person. The three dictators all came to power as young men and expended enormous energy, and indeed, it has to be said, some bravery in achieving power. Trump is 78, and I think it's fair to say that spending a lot of time on golf courses is not part of the job description of a would-be fascist dictator. Moreover, uh, these three individuals were passionately devoted to well-worked out political ideas that they spent their careers trying to put into practice. That certainly does not describe Mr. Trump. Third, each of them came to power partly through the efforts of a paramilitary force. The efforts of the so-called Proud Boys during the events of January 6, 2021 to the contrary, Mr. Trump has nothing like a paramilitary force. So that's the first difference. The second difference is we live in very different times from those in which these dictators came to power and in which the eight titans had their careers. The first half of the 20th century was a period that saw the two world wars, the Great Depression, and decolonization. And these events served collectively as a kind of cosmic bulldozer, knocking down existing political and economic structures and allowing these eight titans to build new ones, radically new ones, and sometimes dreadful ones, in their place. Nothing remotely like that has happened to the United States or the world since the end of World War II. Specifically, Hitler was able to come to power after Germany had experienced what was then the most destructive war in history, which the Germans lost and which cost them 12 to 15% of their territory, and was followed by the worst inflation in its history, which wiped out the savings of the middle class. And finally, the Great Depression, which led to something like 40% of the German workforce unemployed. Needless to say, nothing like that has happened or has any prospect of happening in the United States today. Third, it's worth noting that there are important checks and balances that operate in the American political system and in American society on any politician, including and especially the president. And these checks and balances go beyond those written into the American Constitution. Take two of what are rumored to be major departures Trump has planned for American foreign policy. One is the imposition of 10 or even 20% tariffs on all goods coming into the United States. If Mr. Trump should attempt seriously to impose such a thing, it would have an adverse effect on the markets, on both the financial and the equity markets. And that would make a huge difference on him, to him or anyone who was president. And it would also, excuse me, alarm the American business community, which is an important part of his constituency. The other departure is the possibility that he will simply cut off aid to Ukraine, making it possible for Vladimir Putin's Russia to conquer and occupy that country. But if that happened, it would be a collapse on the order, or rather on a much greater scale than the collapse of Afghanistan that occurred as a result of American policy in the first year of the Biden administration. It would have a devastating effect on the Trump presidency. It would blight that presidency and his historical reputation ever after, something that no president wants to have happen. To conclude, Mark Twain is once said, or is reported to have said, that history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. On the basis of my research and writing that produced the titans of the 20th century, I would say that Trump and Hitler emphatically do not rhyme. Now, it's true that those who did not and do not like Mr. Trump, who did not like his initial presidency, who do not agree with the policies that he's espoused, will not like his second term in office. But that term will end. And when it does end, I believe, none of us will be living in a radically different country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Fascinating presentation. For those of you that are interested in learning more about Michael's book, The 20th Century Titans, I have a link to Amazon in the chat section to the right. Take a look at it and click on that link to learn more about purchasing this book. So certainly, we do live in interesting times, and even in this day and age, all these years since the early 20th century, two countries remain at the forefront of.
We're having Q&A.
Yeah,
Did you talk about these?
excuse me, Jim Larimore, could you please mute your computer? So there are two countries right now that are really at the forefront of discussions, and that's China and Russia. China is still under one of the common terms you hear almost parroted endlessly is Chinese Communist Party. And of course, Russia has reemerged from its communist era and a kind of a imperial, a neo-imperial era. But looking back at the rise of Lenin and his effective organization and achievement of power, and that of Mao, there's communism, which is an ideological framework, and then there's I would posit Leninism that is about organizing, consolidating, and administering power. And that seems to be still very much the case of China today. Could you compare and describe the difference, say, between Leninism and communism, and bring it and tie it in with today's China?
Well, China is Leninist, is communist politically, in that the Communist Party has all power and suppresses all opposition, but it's not communist economically. And that is the work of Deng Xiaoping, who succeeded Mao and who transformed China into a country in which, while the Communist Party maintains its monopoly of power, it has something like a free market economy. And that has enabled the Chinese economy to grow rapidly, and also to incorporate some of the features of high technology, which is what makes China a dangerous rival. So the China that we face today is really the China of Deng Xiaoping, not Mao Zedong. As for Russia, Vladimir Putin is not a communist, and indeed has had unfriendly things to say about Lenin. He is more properly understood, I think, as a traditional Russian imperialist. He harks back to Tsarist days, and he tries to employ some of the symbols of Tsarism. Russia was never really a nation state. It was always an empire, and the Russian Empire expanded steadily. And that's what Putin is trying to do. when he tried to expand it to the south, to the Caucasus, the West objected but didn't do much. But now that he's trying to expand it to the south and to incorporate Ukraine, the West has helped Ukraine resist, really because he's pushing westward and that threatens the West. So I would say that Deng Xiaoping is, if not the heir, the beneficiary of what Deng Xiaoping did. And Putin harks back not to Lenin, but to Tsarist days.
Got it. Thank you. And you spoke about the Cultural Revolution under Mao. Very much a closed system at the time, and the world had very little understanding of what was going on. But the Chinese had a front row seat, those that survived in particular. It seems that that's still in the living memory of many of the, certainly of the elderly in China. Um, would you say that that has got a hangover over Chinese politics?
I believe it does, and it works both ways. On the one hand, Xi Jinping, the current leader, who has aped Mao in some ways, has not tried to unleash chaos the way Mao did with the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. Xi is in some ways reminiscent of Mao, but in other ways his opposite. He believes in order, not chaos, not disorder. So Xi is wary of imposing anything like the Cultural Revolution while keeping the communist power with its firm grip on the society. But people in China who may not appreciate Xi's rule and may want a more liberal, freer political system may also be worried that if the party relinquishes its grip entirely, the result could be chaos, of which China has known a good deal, especially since the middle of the 19th century. So it's perhaps the case that the memories of the Cultural Revolution, which are still relatively fresh, although it ended going on for 60 years ago, those memories both constrain the communist dictatorship, but also constrain those who want something other than a communist dictatorship.
Got it. Looking back to the tenure of FDR, FDR was worldly, educated, sensitive to developments around the world and America's place in that world. He also recognized the limitations of the American public in the context of coming out of the Depression. How did FDR manage a public that had memories of World War I, had been overwhelmed by the Depression, and was now was about to be faced with a huge war in Europe that was going to drag the United States in, most likely? How did FDR go about introducing the American public to that coming reality or even tragedy?
Well, that's a very good question. First, Roosevelt was perhaps the best qualified commander-in-chief the United States had ever had. He was, as you said, cosmopolitan. He'd spent a good deal of time in Europe. He spoke German and French and read them, and he also apparently had some Dutch. And by the way, he was very proud of his Dutch ancestry. He did not see himself as a WASP, that is, being a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant descended from Great Britain. He knew about the history of the Anglo-Dutch wars of the 17th and 18th century, all of which Great Britain knew, and his sympathies were with the Dutch. So that's point one. Point two, there was real resistance to involvement in another world war on the part of the American public. And this was because of the disenchantment that the public had come to have about the results of World War I. They'd been told that this was a war to end all wars, to bring democracy to Europe and the world, and that didn't happen. Furthermore, the Europeans owed the Americans a lot of money, and they weren't paying it off reliably. So Roosevelt was bucking the tide in trying to get the United States more involved in defending Western Europe and defeating Nazi Germany. He understood the situation, and he did what he could to support the British. One very important thing he did that's not widely known, but I discuss it in the chapter on Roosevelt and the Titans of the 20th Century, was that the fall of France in June of 1940, the defeat and occupation of France by Germany, had a profound and traumatic effect, not only in Europe, but on Roosevelt. He, like everyone, had expected that since the French had held out for 4 years in World War I, they'd be able to do the same in World War II, but they were defeated in 6 weeks, putting Britain in a precarious situation. It was because of the fall of France in 1940 that Roosevelt decided to run for a third term. All the evidence we have, and it's not conclusive because Roosevelt confided in nobody, but the evidence we have is that he was planning to bow out after his second term. But with the fall of France, he decided the world was too dangerous for him to abandon the presidency. He did what he could to assist first Britain and then the Soviet Union, and the fall of France had had an effect on American public opinion such that Americans were willing to assist the French and then more grudgingly the Soviets, but still did not want to send American boys to fight in Europe. And in his presidential campaign of 1940, Roosevelt explicitly promised that they would not. So he ran as somebody who would, as Woodrow Wilson ran in 1916, keep your boys out of war. And of course, neither managed to do so. What then made it possible for Americans to send troops to Europe and to Asia? Well, the answer there, I think, is simple. It was Pearl Harbor. The United States was attacked. Had Pearl Harbor not been attacked, I think it's an open question whether the United States would ever have sent troops to fight beyond America's shores. And there's another unexpected event, also underappreciated, also one that I discuss in the Titans of the 20th Century, this time in the chapters on Hitler and Roosevelt. On December 11th, for reasons that are still not clear, Hitler gratuitously declared war on the United States. On December 7th, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Churchill, who was devoting himself to trying to get the United States into the war, worried that because Japan, but not Germany, had attacked the United States would declare war only on Japan and would not fight Germany. 4 days later, for reasons that are still not clear, Hitler solved his problem for him. So the United States, in both the Asian and the European theater, were fighting countries that had declared war on the United States first.
Well, talk about the personal impact on events. That's an extraordinary highlight right there. So I'm going to end the recording now as we move over to the Q&A portion of our program. Again, I urge people to take a look and read Michael Mandelbaum's The Titans of the 20th Century, How They Made History and the History They Made. The link is in the chat box. Thank you.